The Battle of the Trident had been the deciding factor in Robert's rebellion, where the Targaryen and Baratheon forces met in bloody battle. The Royalist forces numbered around 40,000 men, a tenth part of them anointed knights, along with 10,000 Dornishmen, led by the Prince of Dragonstone himself, Rhaegar Targaryen, with 3 Kingsguard accompanying him. They outnumbered the rebel forces of the Baratheons, Starks, Tullys, and Arryns, but these were battle-hardened warriors, and they were led by the imposing Lord of Storm's End, Robert Baratheon. The two armies clashed at the chief crossing of the Trident. Robert commanded his forces with his booming voice as the battle raged around them. The Dornishmen nearly threatened the rebel rear until the notorious Lyn Corbray slew Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard with his father's Valyrian sword, Lady Forlorn. His sworn brother Jonathan Darry was cut down as well, and Barristan Selmy was gravely injured. But the true tide of battle turned when Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen met in single combat on horseback. The two men were evenly matched, for Robert was dealt many grievous wounds by Rhaegar himself. Yet in the end, Robert's size, strength, and his desire for vengeance won him the day when his warhammer struck Rhaegar's chest, scattering the rubies upon his breastplate. Once their prince was slain, the Targaryen forces broke and ran, and victory belonged to the rebels. The battle would set into motion the events that would lead to the Mad King's downfall, and the end of the long reign of House Targaryen. But what if the opposite had occurred? What if the dragon, not the stag, emerged as the victor? How would it have changed the history of the Seven Kingdoms? Well, today, we'll be exploring what would happen if Rhaegar Targaryen won the Battle of the Trident. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Any of these are a great help to the channel. Now in this scenario, Robert and Rhaegar's duel follows much the same as before. However, with each blow Rhaegar inflicts, Robert weakens further and further, until he can endure it no longer. By the end, the last dragon delivers a mortal blow that felled the rebel lord, claiming his life. Prince Lewin successfully kills Lyn Corbray and leads the Dornish forces in breaking the rebel rear. They would be at a severe disadvantage, as the Targaryen forces would surely overwhelm the rebels, in spite of their battle experience. And the other Kingsguard survived too. Jon Darry manages to fend off his attackers, though Barristan Selmy is still gravely injured. With their charismatic leader dead and the Dornishmen encircling them, the rebel forces break and flee the field. The surviving lords, Ned Stark, Hoster Tully, and Jon Arryn, would be forced to retreat to their own respective keeps to muster fresh levies. But the victorious Rhaegar does not pursue them. Why? Well, before the rebellion broke out, he had a strained relationship with his father, King Aerys II. As the years went by, the Mad King grew paranoid that his son was plotting to overthrow him, and Rhaegar plainly saw how his father's instability was harming the Seven Kingdoms. Their rivalry was so great that it was compared to Alicent and Rhaenyra's before the Dance of the Dragons erupted. In the World of Ice and Fire guidebook, it's hinted that the infamous tourney at Harrenhal was secretly orchestrated by Rhaegar himself in order to establish a great council to deal with his father's madness. And finally, in Jaime Lannister's first chapter in A Feast for Crows, he recalls the last words he spoke with Rhaegar before he rode off to the Riverlands. In this chapter, Rhaegar confides this with him.
When the battle is done, I mean to call a council. Changes will be made. I meant to do it long ago, but, well, it does no good to speak of roads not taken. We shall talk when I return.
With that said, it's easy to establish what would happen if Rhaegar emerged as the victor in the Trident. After scattering the remnants of the rebel forces, Rhaegar gathers what remains of his old host and marches towards King's Landing. From there, he establishes a great council, just like he had intended to at Harrenhal. The ruins of the Dragon Pit is chosen to host the gathering, far from the reach of the Red Keep. It should be worth noting that before the rebellion broke out, there were a number of opportunistic lords who profited off of King Aerys' instability, and thus opposed Rhaegar's eventual ascension to the throne. But given that the Mad King murdered Brandon and Rickard Stark and instigated a war, public opinion would surely turn against him, even among his most greedy of nobles. The assembled lords ultimately decide that Aerys was too unstable to rule the realm, and decreed that the Prince of Dragonstone should assume the governance. But Rhaegar decides not to remove his father through abdication, and he is thus named Protector of the Realm and Prince Regent, much like Aemon One-Eye had been during the middle half of the Dance of the Dragons. And it wouldn't be the first time when an heir apparent had to rule in their father's stead. In real-life history, Prince George, the future George IV, assumed the regency of the British Empire on behalf of his father, King George III, during his mental instability from 1811 to 1820. Of course, none of this would have gone unnoticed by the Red Keep. Thanks to Lord Varys and his Whisperers, King Aerys learns of the Great Council's ruling. Unsurprisingly, he rejects it, declaring the assembled lords traitors and rebels, even going so far as disinheriting Rhaegar and naming his younger son, Viserys, as the new heir to the Iron Throne. Moreover, he had hostages within the Red Keep, Rhaegar's wife, Elia Martell, and their children, Princess Rhaenys and the infant Prince Aegon. Aerys warns Rhaegar that should he move against the Red Keep, his wife and children would be put to death. Regardless on what had happened with Lyanna Stark, Rhaegar still cares deeply about his family and would not take any action that would risk their safety. And more importantly, the pyromancers had already placed thousands of jars of wildfire throughout King's Landing as part of Aerys' mad wildfire plot, though at the time, Rhaegar knew nothing of it. It was set into motion since Jon Connington's disastrous defeat at the Battle of the Bells. They had been intended for the rebels, should Robert prevail and march on the city. But now with his son threatening to depose him, the Mad King entertains the idea of using wildfire as a last resort. Fortunately, there was another player within the Red Keep. When Rhaegar Targaryen marched towards the Trident, he took 3 Kingsguard with him: Jonathor Derry, Barristan Selmy, and Prince Lewin Martell. Meanwhile, Gerald Hightower, Arthur Dayne, and Oswell Went were in Dorne, at the Tower of Joy. That left only one Kingsguard in the city, Jaime Lannister. From the moment he donned the white cloak, Jaime had misgivings on the Mad King's countless atrocities, and he was one of the few who knew of the wildfire plot. In the original timeline, when his father's army sacked King's Landing, Jaime was forced to kill the King's Hand, Wisdom Russard, and then the Mad King himself to protect the city from being consumed by wildfire. But in this timeline, the situation is far less chaotic. Instead of a sack, the city becomes a powder keg, waiting to explode. Like in the original timeline, Jaime kills Russard to prevent the wildfire's detonation. But instead of killing Aerys, he chooses to rescue Elia and her children. He cuts down the guards outside their chambers and spirits them outside the Red Keep through one of Maegor's tunnels, much like how Eric Cargill had done for Rhaenys in House of the Dragon. Once beyond the keep's walls, Jaime safely delivers them to the arms of Rhaegar. Without hostages or the means of detonating the wildfires, the Red Keep falls quickly and bloodlessly. Aerys is confined to his chambers, and Rhaegar Targaryen assumes the rule. He swiftly moves to re-establish order. Most of the king's small council is dismissed and replaced with his own subordinates and counselors. All the lickspittles and opportunists at court are removed, and those complicit in the worst of his father's crimes are arrested. Aerys, meanwhile, would fall under the supervision of maesters for the remainder of his life, a fate that would be shared by the young Prince Viserys once he began to display a similar sign of madness. Queen Rhaella is cared for by septas whilst being pregnant with her daughter Daenerys. Last but not least, the Prince Regent would sit in judgment on Jaime Lannister. Despite his heroic deeds during the transition, he also took up arms against the king he swore to protect, thus breaking his Kingsguard vows. That said, he also saved his wife and children from the headsman's axe. So instead of execution or exile to the Night's Watch, Rhaegar elects a different course. He chooses to dismiss Jaime Lannister from the Kingsguard and banishes him from both court and city, like Joffrey Baratheon had done to Barristan Selmy in A Game of Thrones. But whereas Barristan's dismissal was an abject humiliation, Jaime's was a form of political maneuvering on Rhaegar's part. Like Selmy, Jaime is deeply upset by the dismissal, but the Prince Regent secretly assures him that no matter what anyone will say, his actions had saved the realm, and sends him off with his thanks. This shrewd act wins Rhaegar the friendship of Casterly Rock and the Westerlands by restoring Tywin Lannister's favorite son to him. The new Prince Regent would even summon Tywin back to King's Landing to take up the handship once more, for he had need of a hand with the skills needed in putting down rebellious vassals. The best thing to remember is that Rhaegar is not his father. Instead of steel and fire, he preferred reasoned words. And so, the Prince Regent resolved to end the rebellion through negotiations. Ravens flew to Riverrun, the Eyrie, Storm's End, and Winterfell, offering the rebels peace and pardon. Sadly, regardless on who wins the Battle of the Trident, Lyanna Stark still dies while giving birth to Jon Snow. The same fate would befall Queen Rhaella as well, giving birth to Daenerys. Now it is unknown whether or not Rhaegar married Lyanna as shown in Game of Thrones, or if they ran away together in Dorne to simply be in love. He most certainly didn't order an annulment to his marriage to Elia, though if he did marry Lyanna, he could invoke the ancient Valyrian tradition that Aegon the Conqueror and Maegor the Cruel once practiced. But the uncertainty of their relationship leaves the child's true name and status unknown. So for the sake of consistency, we'll still refer to him as Jon Snow. Gerald Hightower, Arthur Dayne, and Oswald Went returned to King's Landing with her corpse and the newborn child. This creates friction between Rhaegar and Elia, as well as angering Doran Martell, the Prince of Dorne. They demand the child to be sent away, viewing him as no more than a bastard. Though Dorne is extremely tolerant of bastards, they see the child as a potential threat to Rhaenys and Aegon. To that, the Prince of Dragonstone sends a special letter to Ned Stark, explaining that he didn't kidnap Lyanna as Robert claimed, but that they fell in love. Rhaegar makes a solemn oath to make reparations to House Stark for the murder of Rickard and Brandon, return Lyanna Stark's bones to be buried beneath the Stark crypt. And above all, he would allow the infant Jon Snow to be raised at Winterfell. To all these terms, Ned Stark agrees. Jon is swiftly sent to the north and lives alongside the Stark children, like in the original timeline. And sadly, Catelyn Stark remains cold and scornful towards Jon, as she blames his father for her betrothed's death at the Mad King's hand. But through Ned's intervention, Hoster Tully and Jon Arryn eventually relent, renewing their fealty to the Iron Throne and returning to the King's peace. The last of the rebels for Rhaegar to pacify is Stannis Baratheon. Since Ashford, the Baratheon seat of Storm's End had been besieged by Mace Tyrell for over a year. The castle garrison was on the point of starvation when the notorious smuggler Davos Seaworth managed to evade the red wine blockade and delivered food to them. However, this was only a short-term solution, and there was only so much a smuggler could do. Stannis' decision to follow his brother was a difficult one, for it came not out of love, but a sense of loyalty to his house and blood. Regardless, for the dishonor the Targaryens had brought upon his house, he would remain defiant. But Stannis isn't his brother. He was cold, stern, and had no true friends among the Stormlords. Some of their houses were even loyal to the Targaryens at the very start of the rebellion. Catherine, Fell, Grandison, and Connington, and only switched sides after Robert Baratheon defeated them at Summerhall. But now with Robert dead, these houses would defect once more to the Targaryens, with most, if not all, of the Stormlands following suit. Rhaegar sends a final letter to Stannis, stating that if he repents his treason, he would command Mace Tyrell to lift the siege, and formally recognize him as the rightful heir to Storm's End. But Stannis, iron-willed and stubborn, refuses and holds out. That is, until the starving garrison betrays him and hands him over to Lord Tyrell, just like what had happened to his ancestor, Argella Durrandon, 300 years ago. Stannis is imprisoned, and the young Renly Baratheon becomes the new Lord of Storm's End and the Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. Within a year, Rhaegar Targaryen ends Robert's rebellion, not with fire and blood, but with words and shrewd determination. But what would a post-rebellion Westeros look like? Well, to answer that question, it would be best to shift away from the world of Ice and Fire and turn our attention towards PlayStation's Horizon series. Set in a post-apocalyptic Earth where the human race has been degraded into multiple differing tribes. One such is the Karja, a powerful kingdom that was once ruled by a Sun King called Jiran. Suffice to say, he was their counterpart to Aerys. He began his reign on a hopeful note, until he descended further and further into insanity, and by the end of his reign, he became known as the Mad Sun King. He was erratic, ill-tempered, and a full-blown psychopath. He saw himself as the living incarnation of the sun, and thus began burning people alive, even his firstborn son. His tyranny spread to the other tribes as well, waging a near-endless cycle of warfare that became known as the Red Raids. This all ended when his second-born son, Avad, rose up and deposed him, becoming the new Sun King. He shares many similarities to Rhaegar. He is compassionate, fair, and has a great love for music and books. He would spend years repairing the damage his father inflicted on the Karja and the other tribes, showing himself as a caring and just ruler. But the fallout of Jiran's regime left bitter anti-Karja sentiments throughout the world, and would be the catalyst for much of the events in the Horizon Games. That said, when compared to Avad, Rhaegar Targaryen's time and power would face a near identical situation. Eventually, Aerys II dies in his chambers, and Rhaegar ascends the Iron Throne as King Rhaegar I Targaryen. However, the Mad King's crimes would leave a bitter anti-Targaryen sentiment throughout Westeros. Not to mention Rhaegar and Lyanna's flight would sour the relationships between Dorne, the Stormlands, and the North with the Iron Throne. However, this would all change with the Greyjoy Rebellion. Regardless if it's a Baratheon or Targaryen sitting upon the Iron Throne, Balon Greyjoy still dreams of an independent Iron Isles under his kingship. Upon the death of his father, Balon would assemble his Iron Fleet, and over time, he would declare himself the King of the Iron Islands. Like in the original timeline, he would send his fleets to burn the Lannister fleet anchored at Lannisport. Like Robert Baratheon, Rhaegar gathers the armies of Westeros and brings their full force to bear on the Krakens. In time, he would eventually subdue the Iron Isles, and Balon would be forced to relinquish Theon Greyjoy to Ned Stark. Rhaegar Targaryen's leadership and skills in battle eventually wins him the grudging respect of the lords that had once fought against him in the rebellion, proving his capabilities in both war and peace. Rhaegar Targaryen spends the entirety of his reign repairing the damage his father inflicted upon the realm, thus bringing forth a new age of peace and justice for Westeros. This new age of prosperity would be passed on to his son and daughter to inherit one day. However, his eventual ascension would throw the schemes of Varys and Illyrio Mopatis into considerable disarray, particularly involving a Blackfyre restoration in the form of young Griff, seeing as in this timeline, baby Aegon is alive and well. But more importantly, Daenerys isn't driven into exile along with her brother. She doesn't marry Khal Drogo, and she doesn't hatch her dragons. Perhaps in this new timeline, when she comes of age, Rhaegar arranges a marriage between her and Jon Snow, thereby mending the wounds of Robert's rebellion. The Silver Prince might have saved the Targaryen dynasty from destruction, but the fate of the world of ice and fire would be shrouded in uncertainty as the cold and the dark descends from the north, and the night skies would never again hear the sweet music of dragons.